Hey everyone, Chris here with one more filler video to fill out the year and give you all an update on just how stupid this year has been for me, at least for the first third of the video. Then I'll be spending some time talking about games and game dev efforts, and then we'll finish things off with what to expect for next year in terms of Ancient DOS games and Shovelware Diggers videos. First, let's address why there was an immediate schedule change halfway through the year. Now, normally my schedule for making ADG videos was to have one out on each of the first 3 Saturdays of every month, but I started missing releases and ultimately shifted the schedule to bi-weekly, having a new ADG video once every 2 weeks. Well, to understand why I made this change, it's best I explain the reasoning chronologically. Thus, we have to first go back to the start of March, when I had a bit of an accident. I was walking down an inclined driveway outside in cold weather and slipped on some black ice. Now, for those unfamiliar with the term, black ice is used to refer to ice which is frozen in such a way as to be completely invisible from one or more angles. As far as my vision was concerned, there was no ice anywhere in front of me. Which wasn't surprising, because again, inclined driveway, how the heck would any water be frozen into ice on it? But yeah, when I slipped, I ended up picking up speed while trying to not fall, but ultimately did fall, the impact of which slammed my right shoulder out of its socket. Now while I was still down, I gently pushed at my shoulder and it popped back into place, and amazingly, apart from a scrape on my leg, I didn't suffer any other bruises or anything, but I was in a massive amount of pain and lost a lot of range of motion in my arm, which I discovered later that night made it impossible for me to sleep in one of my 2 usual sleeping positions. I decided I'd better take a trip to the ER at the hospital just in case, and after some x-rays I was told that, at least from the perspective of my bones, I hadn't broken or splintered anything. So the hope was that after a solid number of weeks my shoulder would be properly healed and things would return to normal. Spoiler alert, they didn't, but I'm getting ahead of myself, as just a couple weeks after this incident I ended up with extremely intense abdominal pain. It flared up over the course of 12 hours and then took 5 freaking days to completely go away, with it taking about 36 hours before the pain was lessened enough that I could actually focus on anything. Now, by coincidence, I had eaten something that didn't taste 100% right, but was still technically in date and didn't taste spoiled either. But either way, the pain was so bad, I decided to take another trip to the ER at the hospital, and the doctor who examined me said he couldn't find anything wrong, though cautioned that for these kinds of issues, a trip to the ER isn't necessarily going to find anything. I ultimately figured maybe I just gave myself a really bad case of food poisoning or something. Except roughly 18 days after that flare-up began, it happened again. And then another 18 days later, it happened again, and then another, and another. I forget if it was the 3rd or 4th time when I realized I'd ruled out virtually everything I was eating and concluded I should try to get proper tests lined up, though I hadn't spoken to my family doctor in over a decade and wasn't sure if that was going to go anywhere. It ultimately did, but it would still be a couple months before I could get some initial tests done, and I want to stress this meant I was spending 5 out of every 18 days in excruciating pain, the first 36 hours of which were so bad I could barely do much of anything. So, shoulder injury, which is making sleep difficult, combined with recurring abdominal attacks resulting in lots of pain, also making it hard to sleep, couldn't possibly get any worse than that, right? Well, then came May and June, the 2 worst months of them all. See, I presently live in a fairly large corporate-owned apartment building on the 13th floor. Well, said corporation decided it's going to do major renovations to a bunch of the units and blame the noise on, quote, necessary repairs. But yeah, almost every weekday of May and June there was super loud hammering and drilling noises starting at 9 a.m. and going all the way to usually around 5:30 p.m. Sleep at this point was now a luxury, and I was getting so little I was honestly surprised I was functioning at all. There were a couple things going sorta right at least, and if I'm remembering right, it was my 8th abdominal attack, which turned out to be surprisingly weak compared to the prior attacks, not getting as intense in pain and lasting only half as long. And then my 9th attack was barely anything, as I could feel it happening, but it was more just discomfort than any real pain. And since then, I have had no more attacks. And still, went ahead with a scheduled ultrasound around that time, but they didn't find anything wrong at all. July was also where I was finally getting my full range of motion back in my shoulder, and then some. Yeah, when I noticed I got back more range of motion than I should, I realized there might be something still wrong with my shoulder, especially since it was still possible for my shoulder to pop out of place. So that meant scheduling a visit with a specialist, which only more recently happened, and the specialist doesn't want to do any deeper tests or imaging without trying physiotherapy first, which there's a 4-month wait list to get going, and unlike all the healthcare I've received up to this point, I don't think the physiotherapy is covered, so I might have to actually pay for it. I doubt it would be ridiculous, I am in Canada after all, but still, getting my proper sleep back is kind of the most important thing. Especially since this still wasn't the end of this year's ridiculousness, as beginning in August, we now had to deal with barking dogs at all hours of the day. I mean, sure, if a dog barks for only a moment, it's not really that unexpected, but when not 1, not 2, but 5 different dogs decide to bark repeatedly for hours on end at nearly any hours of the day, yeah, that got really old really fast, made worse by how loud they were despite having our windows shut. It took a little over 2 months to finally narrow down whose dog was primarily to blame, as well as a couple of the others, and then get the proper complaints launched. But even now, it's still an issue, though not as big of an issue as it was. So, subluxed shoulder which hasn't healed perfectly, recurring abdominal attacks lasting 5 days each, and frequent loud noise in the form of renovations and dogs barking. Mix that all together with the circadian rhythm disorder I've already been suffering from for most of my life, and yeah, most of this year's just been a blur to me due to how little sleep I've been getting. It's only been in the past few weeks where things have finally started improving to some extent and I'm starting to get proper amounts of sleep again, but 1, it's still not perfect sleep given that I have to actively avoid allowing my body to shift into certain positions which would potentially push my shoulder out of its socket again, and 2, the renovations aren't done. They just aren't close enough to our unit anymore to be heard most of the time, so it's still occasionally an issue. This has been a year loaded with physical pain, mental exhaustion, and enough stress to fill a freaking lifetime. This is ultimately the main group of reasons why I changed ADG's schedule suddenly in the middle of the year, because it was no longer reasonable to assume I'd actually be functional for enough hours in a week to produce a video, but across the span of 2 weeks, I should be good. Plus, my reasoning also accounted for if and when my abdominal attacks went away, which they did, in which case I'd have extra time to focus on my game dev projects, and indeed, that's what I've been doing when not working on ADG. And as for Shovelware Diggers, I treat it the same as I always have, weekly unless something makes it impossible to put a video together properly, in which case I don't delay it, I just cancel it for the week and save myself the stress. The stupid doesn't even end there though. Back in July, I woke up one day, checked my emails, and got one which I thought was a joke at first, but turned out to be legitimate. My Digital River account was being terminated due to not having enough transactions. And let's clarify, when I started selling shareware games in 2005, there were very few indie-friendly digital software distribution services out there. People complain about how difficult it is to be an indie on Steam or such now, but it was way harder during most of the 2000s, as most of us instead had to sell our software through our own websites and use middleman services for payment processing, which for me started as ShareIt, but quickly became Digital River when ShareIt was bought out by them. The complicated thing here is that my old shareware titles had serial code systems in them, so each unique purchase had a unique serial code assigned which would have to be input when starting the game for the first time. This wasn't going to translate well to modern game distribution systems like Steam or GOG or such, so I started searching around and it turns out, well, practically no one offers this feature anymore. And save for the high-end sites designed for commercial-grade software, which seems to be what Digital River had been transitioning into over the past few years. That's why they didn't consider my account viable any longer, since I wasn't anywhere close to hitting their new minimum requirement of $6,000 in annual gross sales through their system. This basically left me scrambling to do something I'd planned to do later on when I finally had another game for sale. Make Super Minesweeper and PixelShips Retro freeware. Well, I ran into a couple of issues trying to do this though. The first is that my source code for PixelShips Retro was one version out of date for some reason. Not entirely certain how that happened, but it meant I had to try and remember how I'd previously fixed bugs from the prior version to the current one. The second is that the only way I was going to get these compiled properly was to use the same software I'd used to make them. So I located an old download of the Allegro libraries, booted up Windows XP in a virtual machine, and installed my ancient copy of Microsoft Visual Studio 6 to get everything done and hack out these serial code systems. Though ironically, after looking through my source code for both games, I realized the simplest thing to do wasn't to hack the serial code systems out entirely, but instead placate them. If the serial code check fails, instead of calling the routine to ask you to put one in, these games now simply force a known working serial code into place and then repeats the check, which will obviously come back as successful. I also added in the command line parameters to try and make it easier to get the games working on modern systems, such as changing windowed and full screen mode on startup, as well as color depth, since the games are not hardware accelerated. And then loaded up my old installer creators, created the installers, and there we have it. Freeware versions of Super Minesweeper and PixelShips Retro now available to download on my website, which Windows Smart Screen and several virus and malware scanners immediately flag as dangerous. Yeah, fun fact about the state of malware, so much new malware and viruses are created every day now that the scanner simply can't keep up with identifying specific ones. So as a failsafe, anytime you try to run an executable that's not only unsigned but hasn't built up any file trusts, everything just immediately assumes that it's out to destroy your computer. Even a signed executable would generate the same problem if file trusts haven't been built up. And while services exist to help deal with this, since it would be hard to distribute software otherwise, they cost hundreds of dollars to use. And heck, even when Toby Fox originally released the first chapter of Deltarune in the guise of a quote, survey program, he ran into the same issue. But since his stuff is immensely popular, it didn't stay an issue for long because the file trusts built up really quickly. But yeah, generally speaking, it's difficult to distribute software independently when you don't have a lot of cache, and it hasn't really gotten any easier. The trick is, as more people download these new freeware versions of my games and indicate that they want to run these files despite the risks, given that they're unsigned and trust hasn't been built up yet, it will ultimately bring that level of trust up. So that's basically all it comes down to, is if you want to play these old titles of mine in their newly freeware state, be prepared to be told that they're highly dangerous to your computer. And speaking of games, there were a couple neat things about this year which absolutely got my attention. The aforementioned Deltarune had its second chapter released as freeware in September, and while you can beat it casually in about 3 hours, I've spent a lot of time checking it out and finding all the little secrets and hidden messages and stuff that I could. Naturally, I blame this little bundle of fluffiness because I absolutely adore the character of Ralsei, so much so that I actually spent half a year right before the pandemic started making a me-sized version of him in plushie form, because I wasn't about to consign my desire for hugs from someone who's now my most favorite animated character of all time just to my imagination. I also finally had a chance to check out the playable demo for Tunic, a game I've been waiting for ever since it was originally announced many years ago as Secret Legend, though it was time limited and thus I'm not able to show you footage of it now. Now granted, the playable demo I did get to play represented the game in a much earlier state, as I believe it's the same one that's been showcased at various gaming events over the years, and it's got about 45 minutes of gameplay to it for a casual run, and it wasn't bad. But what really surprised me was the difficulty, as it was a lot more challenging than I was expecting, where simple mistakes could cost you half your health or more, plus if you died or healed at a checkpoint, all the enemies would respawn. But you'd also get all of your healing potion uses back. Yeah, it was definitely fun, but definitely harder than it looks. In terms of my own games, I'm presently revising the script for something I've been calling Project LJ, with LJ being the initials of the game's actual name. The Project LJ represents a game idea I've actually had for many years now, roughly 2005-2006 when I initially came up with it. But while I had a rough idea for the story for over a decade, I couldn't really think of any mechanics that would make sense for it. The game involves a character by the name of Todd, whom I created way back around the turn of the century, originally for a Megazooks game I was making called Treasure Hunt 4, given that I'd made 3 other really simple games in QBasic using the name Treasure Hunt prior. And while I always envisioned Todd and his friends as starring in a platformer, the rough story I came up with really wasn't platformer material. So I just sort of shelved the idea and never went anywhere with it. But back when I first watched a full run of Undertale in late 2015, as I didn't play the game myself until about a year later, suddenly this idea of mine was on the table again, because Undertale's mechanics would have worked perfectly for my game idea. Except, is that really what I wanted to make? Something that would effectively be called an Undertale clone? So I spent a solid number of weeks trying to rationalize how I could make it its own thing and get away with it, but ultimately realized nothing I did would escape that fate. So again, shelve the idea, because even though Undertale's mechanics would fit my story perfectly, I didn't want to make a clone, I wanted to make something which stood out on its own for its own reasons. And then Deltarune hit me so strongly when its first chapter debuted in 2018, I was like, okay, enough screwing around, I'm just going to write the story even though I have no idea how I'm going to make the game itself, and just hope inspiration hits on how I can take the Undertale/Deltarune formula and put my own spin on it that separates it from those games. And then 2 weeks later, I did indeed finally figure out how to do just that. But shelved the project again anyways after a few months because it was too big, and at the time I felt I should make something smaller to get myself back into things first. And then during the pandemic I got an Oculus Rift S and got into VR stuff and started getting VR game ideas. And basically, things have just been an unfocused mess in terms of actual planning for my own game dev efforts. But after playing the second chapter of Deltarune back in September, I began to realize why I was having second thoughts about Project LJ. And basically it was because I had a main story, but not really a good method of driving it. The story I'd written had all these points to it, but was chock full of static characters, never learning, never changing, never growing, and there was surprisingly little humor. Now, one of the things Toby Fox mentioned about making the second chapter of Deltarune was that he felt it was one of the silliest things he'd ever written. And upon reflecting on the story that he presented, I realized that was what was missing from my story. It was too serious for how not serious the world I had created was. It required more silliness. So I began revising the story, sharing my initial revisions with friends and other people that I trust, and the response was pretty unanimous. Freaking do it! As such, I'm about 280 pages into my script revisions, representing 90% of the main story as presented, with one of the partner characters you can have out of 6. So probably about another 200-ish pages to go once I add in all the variations depending on who your partner is at each point in time. And once that's all done, I'll have pretty much everything I need in place conceptually to resume practical development work on the game. Will people liking it as an Undertale or Deltarune clone when it's ready to go a couple or so years from now? Yeah, probably, but at least there's enough different with it that it can do things that those two games can't, so it should be able to stand on its own regardless. And besides, one of the driving forces for me behind even attempting this at all is that the world needs more games like Undertale and Deltarune, and I know I can pull this off given enough time, effort, and focus. This is also why I never got back into streaming. I used to live stream on Sundays, but since all the problems of the year got so out of hand, I haven't been streaming anymore, and I don't see myself streaming again anytime soon. Instead, I'm using that time to focus on whatever tasks I have in front of me, be it ADG or my games. And speaking of ADG, that's probably something a lot of people have been curious about by now, is how am I going to handle ADG for 2022, given that episode 300 is going to be right in the middle of the year? Well, my plan is for episode 300 to take an extra week or two to make. Then I'll be taking another extra week or two off from ADG videos in order to make the Season 7 assets. And then ADG will resume into Season 7 right in the middle of the year. As for what I plan to do for episode 300, I have a couple of ideas, and I'm not sure which I'm going to go with, but I will say it's not going to be anywhere near as epic as bursting a bubble with a nuclear bomb or taking command of a starship. In fact, I don't really plan to do any major acting on camera or anything for it. In terms of videos themselves, this will be the last one I make for the year, as I'll be taking December off from all videos entirely, and already drew Shovelware Diggers to a close for the year earlier in the week, with week number 250. Ancient DOS games will resume right at the start of 2022 on Saturday, January 1st, and will continue to be bi-weekly once every 2 weeks, while Shovelware Diggers will resume on Wednesday, January 5th with week 251, and will continue to be weeklies, save for any weeks where life decides to be annoying and derail the process. I suppose the last thing I should mention too before I sign off for the rest of the year is that I don't see making videos as my endgame. In fact, I never have. I know what my sub counts, ad revenue, and Patreon support are all like, and they're not lifelong sustainable, not for the kind of content I've been making. My Patreon revenue is a public number. You can go there right now and see what it is, which as of this moment is floating around the $700 a month mark. I'll subtract about $60 from that number for the people I support over on Patreon myself, add about $60 to $80 a month from YouTube ad revenue, and that's it. That's my monthly income. The only reason I can live off of this is because I'm splitting living costs with my father, who's not going to be around forever, nor should there be an expectation of us supporting each other forever. So this number needs a considerable boost if I'm to get my life in order. And I see making games as either supplementing this in the long run, or if I'm extremely lucky, replacing it entirely. And this isn't a secret or anything, just not something I often elaborate on. But yeah, I see my success as either being a mix of making games and videos, or just making games. And this is why I desperately need to get back into the groove of game development. I've just been extremely aimless after Text Mode 2000 didn't work out, and over half of this year was pretty much a write-off thanks to all the stupid that happened, so I ended up getting very little practical work done. Though I did put effort into learning more about Godot Engine and Unreal Engine, ultimately deciding that Godot's the better choice for 2D and Unreal's the better choice for 3D. And I already know what my next 3 game projects after Project LJ are going to be, as I have a couple excellent VR ideas, both of which would support non-VR play, and I have the story completely written for PixelShips 2 as well. So even though I have nothing tangible to show, I have indeed been making strides despite the difficulties I've faced, and I really hope to have something to show for all the efforts soon. But time will ultimately tell. As for now though, it's time to begin my break from videos for the rest of the year. Many thanks to everyone who's been sticking around and showing their support, whether you're doing it monetarily through Patreon, through likes, favorites, or subscribes over on YouTube, through retweets over on Twitter, or just referencing my videos when you talk about what got you back into a particular old DOS title. I do not take for granted that you've all basically given me my chance to succeed at life, and will continue making videos for as long as it makes sense to do so. But we all need our time off, so off I go. See you all in 2022. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small set of you guys.